Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about China's military modernization. They see the aircraft carriers, the hypersonic missiles, the expanding navy, and they assume this is about matching American firepower. On the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? That's how great power competition has always worked, right? Build bigger fleets, develop faster missiles, outspend your rival until they can't keep up. But here's where it gets interesting, and honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how China is actually approaching the competition with the United States. Because while everyone is counting ships and comparing missile ranges, China just deployed something that doesn't show up on any military balance sheet. It's not a weapon system in the traditional sense. There are no explosive warheads, no aircraft carriers, no divisions of troops. And yet, within the next decade, this single mechanism will likely accomplish what no military confrontation ever could. It will fundamentally restructure the global economy in ways that make American military dominance increasingly irrelevant. The weapon I'm talking about is the digital yuan, and specifically the cross-border interbank payment system that China has been quietly building for the past 8 years. Most people have never heard of it, and that's not an accident. You know what's fascinating to me? If you ask most people what gives the United States its global power, they'll mention the military. Maybe the Navy, which controls the world's shipping lanes. Maybe the nuclear arsenal. Maybe the alliance structure. All of those things matter, but they're actually downstream from something more fundamental. The real foundation of American power, the thing that makes everything else possible, is not visible on any battlefield. It's a payment system. It's called SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, and it processes roughly 42 million financial messages every single day. That's how international trade actually works. When a company in Germany wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, when a manufacturer in Vietnam needs to pay a supplier in Taiwan, when any cross-border transaction happens anywhere in the world, the payment instructions flow through SWIFT. And here's the critical detail that most people never think about. SWIFT is dominated by Western banks, operates under Western legal frameworks, and the United States has veto power over who gets access to it. This is how sanctions actually function. When the United States wants to apply economic pressure, it doesn't need to impose tariffs or blockades. It just removes a country's access to SWIFT. Suddenly, Iran can't sell oil to international customers. Russia can't receive payments for natural gas exports. Venezuela can't access international credit markets. The military doesn't need to enforce these restrictions. The banks do it automatically, because operating outside the SWIFT system is economically impossible for any country trying to participate in global trade. This is the architecture that has allowed the United States to run massive fiscal deficits for decades without collapsing its currency. The entire world needs dollars to conduct international trade, which creates structural demand for American currency, which allows the Federal Reserve to print money that other countries are forced to absorb. It's a closed-loop system that has sustained American power for 50 years, and China is about to break it. To understand why that matters so much, you have to think about what systems dependency actually represents in great power competition. There's a concept in strategic theory called the key terrain principle. In traditional military terms, key terrain means the geographic position that, once controlled, determines the outcome of the entire battle. Think about a mountain pass that funnels all movement through a single choke point, or a river crossing that armies must use to advance. Whoever controls that position controls the battlefield, regardless of how many troops or weapons the other side possesses. Now extend that concept beyond physical geography to economic systems. What is the key terrain of the modern global economy? It's not oil fields, although those matter. It's not manufacturing capacity, although that matters too. It's the payment infrastructure that allows value to flow across borders. Whoever controls that infrastructure controls the entire system, because every other form of economic activity depends on it. For the past 70 years, that key terrain has been completely controlled by the United States and its allies. The dollar, SWIFT, the network of Western banks, the legal frameworks that govern international finance, all of it operates under American influence. This gives the United States something that no amount of military hardware could provide: The ability to shape the behavior of every country on Earth without firing a single shot. Want to pressure a government, cut off its access to dollar financing, want to reward an ally, provide favorable access to American markets and credit. The entire architecture of global power rests on this foundation. And now watch what happens when someone builds an alternative system. China's cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, went live in 2015, but nobody paid much attention because it was small and its functionality was limited. In its first year, it processed maybe a few $100 billion worth of transactions, which sounds like a lot until you realize SWIFT handles trillions of dollars daily. But here's what changed. By 2023, CPS was processing over 80 trillion yuan annually, roughly 13 trillion US dollars. More importantly, it now connects to over 1,300 financial institutions in more than 100 countries and regions. And in March of this year, China announced that CPS has achieved full operational independence from SWIFT's messaging protocols. What that means in practice is that countries can now conduct international trade, settle payments, and access credit markets entirely outside the dollar SWIFT system. For the first time in 7 decades, there is a genuine alternative to Western-controlled financial infrastructure. Let me walk you through exactly why this is different from previous challenges to dollar dominance, because the details matter here. The euro was supposed to challenge the dollar's reserve currency status, and in some ways it did. Today, roughly 20% of global reserves are held in euros compared to about 58% in dollars. But the euro didn't actually create an alternative payment system. European banks still use SWIFT. European countries still face American sanctions enforcement. When the United States imposed sanctions on Iran, European companies that wanted to continue trading with Tehran found themselves unable to do so, despite the European Union officially opposing the sanctions. Why? Because the payment infrastructure remained under American influence. The banks couldn't process the transactions even if the governments wanted to permit them. China's approach is fundamentally different. CIPS isn't just an alternative currency denomination, it's an alternative infrastructure, an entirely separate network of banks, clearinghouses, and legal frameworks that operates independently of Western financial institutions. This means that when countries trade using CIPS, American sanctions become unenforceable. If Saudi Arabia wants to sell oil to China, and China wants to pay in yuan through CIPS, there is no mechanism through which the United States can prevent that transaction. The American financial system never touches it. SWIFT never sees it. Western banks have no leverage over it. The transaction happens in a parallel universe where American power simply doesn't reach. Now add to this something that makes the CIPS system particularly significant for countries currently sitting on the fence about which economic bloc to align with. China has spent the past 5 years building what it calls the digital currency electronic payment system, the digital yuan. This is not a cryptocurrency in the Bitcoin sense. It's a central bank digital currency, meaning it's issued directly by the People's Bank of China and operates under Chinese government control. But unlike physical currency, it can be programmed with specific conditions, tracked in real time, and integrated directly into the CIPS payment infrastructure. What this creates is a payment system where settlements happen instantly, transaction costs drop to near zero, and the entire process operates outside the dollar system while providing more efficiency than the dollar system currently offers. Think about what happens when developing countries start calculating the economics here. Right now, if you're a government in Africa or Southeast Asia, or Latin America, and you want to import goods from China, you need to acquire dollars first. That means selling your own currency to buy dollars, which creates downward pressure on your currency value and forces you to maintain dollar reserves that earn minimal interest. Then you use those dollars to pay the Chinese exporter, who receives dollars but ultimately wants yuan, so they have to convert the payment back into their own currency. Every step of this process involves transaction costs, exchange rate risk, and dependency on Western financial institutions that can impose conditions, monitor your behavior, or cut you off if American policy preferences change. Now imagine the alternative. You negotiate directly with a Chinese exporter in yuan. The payment flows through CIPS, settles instantly using digital currency, and the entire transaction happens without ever touching the dollar system. No currency conversion costs, no exchange rate risk, no exposure to American sanctions or political pressure. And because China is your largest trading partner anyway, which is true for over 120 countries worldwide, the yuan you acquire through exports to China can be used directly to pay for imports from China. The system creates a closed loop that doesn't need dollars at all. Here's the second thing to understand. China is not trying to replace the dollar globally. That would be impossible, and more importantly, unnecessary. What China is doing is far more strategic. It's creating a parallel financial architecture that serves specific regions and specific trade relationships where China already has dominant economic position. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative countries. China has invested over $1 trillion in infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. These aren't just development projects. They're the physical foundations of a yuan-denominated trade network. The ports, the railways, the power plants, the telecommunications networks, they all create economic relationships where Chinese currency and Chinese payment systems become the natural medium of exchange. In Pakistan, Chinese firms have built power plants that generate 30% of the country's electricity. The payment arrangements for those plants are denominated in yuan. In Kenya, Chinese contractors built the standard gauge railway connecting Nairobi to Mombasa. The financing is in yuan. In Saudi Arabia, Chinese companies are constructing entire industrial cities as part of Vision 2030. The contracts are increasingly settled in yuan through CIPS. This is not about convincing every country on earth to abandon the dollar. It's about creating regional networks where the yuan is simply more practical, more efficient, and less politically risky than the dollar. Now layer on top of that the question of energy markets, because this is where the systemic implications become genuinely difficult to ignore. Oil has been priced in dollars since 1974, when the United States and Saudi Arabia reached an agreement that required all Saudi oil sales to be denominated in dollars. This created the petrodollar system, which generates enormous structural demand for American currency. Every country needs dollars to buy energy, which means every country needs to run trade surpluses with the United States or accumulate dollar reserves, which means the United States can run perpetual trade deficits without experiencing currency collapse. The federal government can spend beyond its tax revenue. The Federal Reserve can expand the money supply, and inflation remains manageable because the entire world absorbs the excess dollars by needing them for energy purchases. But watch what's happening now. In March 2023, China completed its first liquefied natural gas transaction, with France using yuan instead of dollars. The payment flowed through CIPS. No American banks involved, no dollar conversion required, no exposure to SWIFT monitoring or sanctions risk. In December of the same year, the China National Offshore Oil Corporation signed a 27-year LNG supply agreement with Qatar, denominated entirely in yuan. Saudi Arabia, which has priced its oil in dollars exclusively for nearly 50 years, announced in 2022 that it is open to accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases. Russia, cut off from SWIFT after the Ukraine invasion, now conducts 95% of its trade with China in yuan and rubles, settling through CIPS. These are not symbolic gestures. These are structural shifts in how the world's largest energy markets actually operate. China is the world's largest oil importer, consuming roughly 15 million barrels per day. If even half of those purchases shift to yuan settlement, that represents over $400 billion per year in reduced dollar demand. And the trend is accelerating, not slowing. Every country that faces American sanctions pressure has overwhelming incentive to build alternative payment capacity. Every country worried about future sanctions has incentive to diversify away from dollar dependency. Every country watching the United States weaponize the SWIFT system understands that access to that system is conditional and revocable. Let me show you exactly how this dynamic compounds through a detailed scenario, because the second-order effects are what most analysis misses. Imagine you're a finance minister in Indonesia. Your economy depends heavily on trade with China, which buys your natural resources and sells you manufactured goods. For decades, you've conducted this trade through dollar intermediation because that's how the system worked. But now you're watching several things happen simultaneously. First, China offers to settle your bilateral trade in yuan through CIPS, which would eliminate your currency conversion costs and reduce your need for dollar reserves. Second, the United States is pressuring you to restrict Chinese technology companies from operating in your telecommunications sector, threatening sanctions if you don't comply. Third, you've watched Russia, Iran, and Venezuela get cut off from SWIFT, and you understand that if Washington decides your policies are unacceptable, your access to the dollar system could disappear overnight. What's your rational move? You start diversifying. You don't abandon the dollar completely because you still trade with the United States and Europe, but you begin denominating your China trade in yuan. You start building up yuan reserves instead of just dollar reserves. You connect your banks to CIPS, and when the United States threatens sanctions, you have a credible alternative that makes the threat less coercive. You can say, look, we'll comply with some of your demands, but understand that cutting us off from SWIFT is no longer an economic death sentence. We have options now. This is the trap that American policymakers are starting to recognize, but don't know how to escape. Every time the United States uses sanctions as a foreign policy tool, it demonstrates to every other country that dollar dependency is a vulnerability. Every time SWIFT access gets weaponized, it creates incentive for alternative infrastructure development, and China has provided that alternative at exactly the historical moment when American sanctions use has reached unprecedented levels. According to the Treasury Department's own data, the United States currently maintains sanctions programs against 38 different countries, affecting roughly 1/3 of the world's population. Every single one of those countries has overwhelming incentive to adopt CIPS for whatever trade relationships they can shift outside the dollar system. Now project this forward, and what you see is not a sudden collapse or a binary switch where countries abandon the dollar and adopt the yuan overnight. What you see is gradual erosion, a slow bleed where dollar dominance recedes from specific regions and specific transactions while remaining important in others. Trade within Asia increasingly settles in yuan. Energy markets gradually diversify into multi-currency pricing. Developing countries hold more mixed reserve portfolios instead of pure dollar holdings. The process takes 15 years, maybe 20. But the direction is clear and the momentum is building. And here's where the strategic calculation becomes genuinely difficult for the United States. How do you respond to this? You can't sanction China for building a payment system. You can't bomb CIPS installations. You can't arrest the digital yuan. The competition is happening in a domain where American military power provides no advantage. The traditional tools of great power competition, the aircraft carriers, the missile systems, the alliance networks, they don't address the fundamental challenge. China is restructuring the global economy in ways that make American military dominance increasingly irrelevant to the actual distribution of power. The immediate tactical implications are already visible. American sanctions are becoming less effective even against countries that remain connected to SWIFT because those countries now have alternatives for their most critical trade relationships. When the United States threatened secondary sanctions against countries buying Iranian oil, China simply routed the payments through CIPS and purchased the oil anyway. American enforcement became impossible because the transactions never touched American jurisdiction. Russia, despite being largely cut off from Western financial markets, continues trading with most of the developing world through yuan-denominated arrangements that bypass sanctions entirely. The weapon that the United States has relied on for decades to project power without military force is losing its effectiveness. At the regional level, watch what this means for alliance structures in Asia. Countries like South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines face an increasingly acute dilemma. They maintain security alliances with the United States that depend on American military protection, but their economic futures are tied to China, which is their largest trading partner by significant margins. As long as economic integration required dollar-denominated trade, these countries remained embedded in American-led financial architecture even as their China trade grew. But CIPS changes the calculation. They can now maintain deep economic integration with China while reducing their exposure to American financial leverage. The choice between security alignment and economic alignment becomes less binary. For the Middle East, the implications cascade even faster. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf states have based their security arrangements on American military protection in exchange for dollar-denominated oil sales. But American energy independence through shale production has reduced strategic dependence on Gulf oil. Meanwhile, China has become the largest customer for Middle Eastern energy exports. The Gulf states are watching the United States use sanctions aggressively against countries like Iran, while simultaneously reducing reducing its military footprint in the region. The logic of the old bargain is breaking down. If they can sell oil to their largest customer in that customer's currency through a payment system that eliminates sanctions risk, while the security guarantees they're getting from Washington become less reliable anyway, what exactly is the dollar peg protecting them from? Globally, this feeds into debt sustainability crises across the developing world. Roughly 60 countries currently face serious debt distress, owing over $600 billion in dollar-denominated debt service over the next 5 years. The strong dollar makes this debt burden increasingly unpayable. But if these countries can shift their trade to yuan settlement through CIPS, they reduce their need for dollar revenue. They can negotiate debt restructuring with Chinese creditors in yuan terms rather than dollar terms. And China, which holds over $1 trillion in claims on developing countries through Belt and Road lending, has every incentive to facilitate this transition. It transforms China's debt exposure from risky dollar-denominated loans into yuan-denominated claims that can be serviced through trade rather than financial markets. At the structural level, this is where you have to zoom all the way out and look at what's actually happening to the global order that has existed since 1945. That order rested on American ability to provide security through military dominance and economic access through dollar-based trade. But those two pillars are becoming disconnected. Countries can now access Chinese-led economic networks without accepting American security arrangements. They can participate in global trade without exposing themselves to American financial leverage. The architecture that forced countries to choose American leadership or economic isolation is coming apart, and the feedback loops accelerate the process. As more countries adopt CIPS, the network becomes more valuable to every other country considering adoption. As more trade settles in yuan, more countries need yuan reserves, which increases demand for yuan-denominated assets, which deepens Chinese financial markets, which makes the yuan more attractive as a reserve currency. The system feeds on itself. This is not like previous challenges to American financial dominance, where alternatives existed in theory, but never achieved the scale necessary to become practical. This is a system that has already reached critical mass and continues expanding. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not chaos and unpredictable disruption. What you see is very deliberate trap. A trap built not through active manipulation, but through patient construction of alternatives while the United States was focused elsewhere. For 20 years, American foreign policy has been consumed by the war on terror, then by great power, military competition with China, then by containing Russia. Meanwhile, China was building the financial infrastructure that undermines the foundation of American power more effectively than any military competition could. The real question is not whether CIPS will continue expanding. The trajectory is already clear. The question is whether the United States can adapt to a world where dollar dominance is regional rather than global, where financial coercion becomes less effective, where military superiority doesn't translate into economic leverage the way it did for the past 70 years. Because right now, American strategy still operates as if the dollar's reserve currency status is permanent, as if SWIFT access is an unassailable source of leverage, as if the global economy has no choice but to orbit around American financial markets. But empires do not fall overnight. They erode. The process is gradual, almost invisible in any single year, but unmistakable across decades. And right now, the conditions for that erosion are assembling with remarkable speed. Every sanctions program that pushes countries toward alternatives, every weaponization of SWIFT that demonstrates the risk of dollar dependency, every expansion of CIPS that makes yuan settlement more practical, they all compound in the same direction. The next time you hear about a country signing a trade agreement denominated in yuan, or a regional bloc exploring alternatives to dollar reserves, or China expanding CIPS to new markets, try holding all of these things together in the same frame. Because they're not separate stories, they're different angles on the same story. The story of how key terrain in great power competition shifts beneath everyone's feet while they're watching the wrong battlefield entirely.